Presented by Caltech.
Wow. That's all I can say. Wow. That was such a perfect speech, lecture. Ahmed taking us through time and space of your life as a young boy in Egypt, all the way here to Pasadena, through the 40 years of time. Fabulous, thank you. And I think an inspiration for all the students that are in the audience, inspiration for the faculty, your friends in the world, and then especially maybe for some young 30-year-old postdocs out there or young people to hear your lecture. Because you remember with great humility when you were a young boy coming from Egypt, you could have gone to Moscow, you told me, remember? It's a flip of the coin. Because that's where young Egyptians were going in those days, and you made your bet on the United States. And it's turned out not only so fabulous for you, but so fabulous for Caltech. We are so lucky. Thank you, Ahmed. And thank you to Ahmed's family. It's great to see Dima here and Maha, just fantastic. Okay, well, we have to get on with the program. And so it's now time to introduce Roger Kornberg, the Mrs. George A. Winsner Professor in Medicine at Stanford University Medical School. Early in his career, Roger made very important contributions to the existence and structure of the nucleosome, which established his role as a world-leading biochemist. He received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2006 for his groundbreaking work on the structure of RNA polymerase II. And Ahmed, you had a beautiful graphic up there of Roger's spectacular work. And the elucidation of the RNA polymerase transcription machinery, how does the machine work, and his discovery of the mediator of transcriptional regulation. As I mentioned, he's a personal friend. We spend time now since 2008 with Ahmed twice a year in Houston. And I must just say, to sit in a room with Roger is amazing. You sit in a room and he has extraordinary intellectual range, deep across topics from chemistry, biophysics, biochemistry, biology, and human medicine. And then in addition, like Ahmed, and I think that's why you two guys are such close friends, he devotes significant effort on global affairs as they relate to science, education, and world peace. I'm sure you'd want me to mention Yali's not here, but his longest and closest collaborator is his wife, Yali Lorch, and she's here in spirit. So come up and give your lecture. Please, Roger. The title of his lecture is The End of Disease. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, thank you for such an extraordinarily kind and generous introduction. It is a really great privilege to honor what is, amongst my acquaintance, the greatest scientist and the greatest human being of our time. I can remember, as I'm sure many of you do, the feeling of awe reading Ahmed's papers showing the actual progress of chemical reactions. And like I'm sure also many of you, no less in awe of his social consciousness and commitment and contributions to society. And I must say that it isn't only those of us gathered today who are so deeply impressed. I can tell you about the way in which Ahmed's fame has spread worldwide. A colleague of mine at Stanford who was educated at the American University in Beirut and still enjoys watching movies that are made in the Middle East. He watches them in the evening. And indeed, Ahmed and Dima met him at our home one evening. He told me about a film he was watching in which one of the characters asked another a difficult question, to which the response was, "Who do you think I am, Ahmed Zewail?" I would have to say the same thing. I might aspire to, but could never achieve the brilliance or the range or the extraordinary wealth of accomplishment of Ahmed Zewail, but I can enjoy admiring his accomplishment. And I therefore especially thank you, Ahmed, for your example, for your guidance and your friendship, and for the opportunity of celebrating with you today. I can talk about something that we do share, which is an appreciation for the power of chemistry and its possibilities for the future. I do so in the context of what is written on the screen, the title of my lecture, which I must say is partly self-mocking with a question mark. Some of you might possibly remember a famous book by Francis Fukuyama called The End of History. It was published in 1992, and it was just in the aftermath of perestroika and the end of the Cold War. And the book argued for the triumph of free market capitalism and of liberal democracy, which it said would become the final form of government. We all know what happened after that. The triumph was short-lived. The end of disease is a question. It's a question about the future of medicine. I imagine that someone who knows more about the subject, like David Baltimore, could address this from the standpoint of human biology. I must do so in the spirit of Ahmed Zewail from the standpoint of chemistry. Many believe, certainly I do and Ahmed, that all of life is understandable in terms of chemistry. So all of life, including disease, should be subject to control by chemistry. The extent to which that is accomplished, of course, is the question for the future. It's not surprising that the outcome is still in doubt. The reason is because modern medicine is only about 100 years old. A little over a century ago, disease was attributed to an imbalance of humors, and the only treatments were bleeding and violent purgatives. Medical schools at the time, this is about a century ago, were trade shops. They were funded by fees from the students who gained licenses to inflict their ignorance on the general population. Change began actually in Europe in the latter part of the 19th century with the germ theory of disease attributed to Pasteur and Koch, Ehrlich and others. Charles Eliot, who was then president of Harvard, was aware of these developments and of the appalling state of American medical education. And he proposed to introduce science in the medical science in the curriculum at Harvard Medical School. The most powerful member of the faculty objected. He said, "Eliot actually proposes to have written examinations for the degree of Doctor of Medicine." I had to tell him that more than half our students cannot write. No medical school has thought it proper to risk large existing classes and large receipts by introducing rigorous standards. We all know what followed: the rise of medicine in the 20th century, from roots in science and from exploration in all fields, from physics to biology. Now, if I were to ask members of this audience what were the most important advances in medicine during this past century, I'm sure that many of you would make a similar list. You would think of X-rays, important both for diagnosis and treatment. You would think of antibiotics, which have largely eradicated bacterial disease. You would mention perhaps cell culture, which led to the polio vaccine. Non-invasive imaging, especially magnetic resonance imaging or MRI, for the early detection of cancer, for diagnosis of many soft tissue conditions. Perhaps genetic engineering, which is the basis of most new medicines, and so forth. These medical advances all have one thing in common. They were all discoveries made in the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, with no idea of any application, no purpose in the prevention or the cure of disease. The discovery of X-rays, which was the first that I mentioned, is, I think, a case in point, and it illustrates what I have said very well. So X-rays were discovered by Wilhelm Röntgen. He was the only child of a textile merchant in the Netherlands, and at the age of 18, he was permanently expelled from school for refusing to inform on a classmate who had drawn a caricature of a teacher. Nevertheless, went on to an academic career. He became professor of physics and chair of the department at the University of Würzburg, where in 1895 he was investigating the effects of electrical discharge in a cathode ray tube. And he happened to notice a faint light on a fluorescent screen elsewhere in the laboratory. When he put his hand over the tube to try and block what was passing between, then he saw on the screen the skeleton, the bones of his fingers. Within a couple of years, X-rays had come into use in medicine. They found application originally for imaging, and as we know later, for treatment. And in 1901, Röntgen was awarded the first Nobel Prize in physics. Now, as I've said, the discovery of X-rays is just one of many examples, but the lesson of the past is clear, and it's counterintuitive. To solve a difficult problem, for example, in medicine, don't study it directly, but rather, as Ahmed has just told us, pursue a curiosity about nature. And solutions to problems will follow. Do basic research. Now, I promised a chemical perspective on the advance of medical science. And so I'm going to mention just a couple of examples of recent advances with an apology to those who are not chemists, and if I fail even to sufficiently explain in lay terms. But I think at least what I will succeed in conveying in just a couple of minutes is the power and the excitement of chemistry. So what I'll tell you about are a couple of recent advances that I think promise to revolutionize drug development and create new, much more powerful oral medications, that is, pills or tablets, for the treatment of disease. For the past several decades, the pharmaceutical industry was based on what are called high-throughput screens. In this process, molecules were tested for their ability to bind to a target, to interact usually with a protein involved in disease, to prevent its function, and so to interrupt the progress of the disease. In this method called high-throughput screens, 1 million molecules, which may be synthesized by chemists or they may be isolated from nature, are tested against a particular disease target. If the chemists involved get lucky, they may find one that works. Performing 1 million such tests, of course, is extremely expensive, very time-consuming, and it works very poorly. If at all, most of the time it doesn't work at all. The reason is because there are so many possible molecules, testing only 1 million is not enough. Finding the right one, the chances of finding the right one amongst 1 million are very small. If there is any hint of success, a molecule that may work is found, then usually hundreds of chemists are employed in a company like Merck or Pfizer or what have you, to make random changes in the molecule in the hope of improving its efficacy. And the end result is often a drug that is still not very effective and that has serious side effects. So I'll mention, just as I say, 2 examples of how one may improve on this process. One was proposed years ago by, actually more than 20 years ago, by Sidney Brenner and Richard Lerner at Scripps. And their idea was to make a mixture of molecules by chemical synthesis in which they would add one building block, indicated here BB for building block, at a time. One, then another, and then another, to construct a molecule that might possibly have a utility as a drug. At each step, they would append a short DNA molecule, a different one at every stage. And at the end, they had a mixture of such molecules to a protein target involved in disease. One that interacts with the target is present in a very small amount, and the chemical moiety, the collection of building blocks stitched together, cannot be directly detected. But the DNA can be read, its sequence determined by the powerful methods recently invented for sequencing the human genome. And the sequence of the DNA informs the chemist what are the building blocks. And in this way, the molecule that interacts with the target is identified. Now, what matters here is that not just 1 million, but 1 million molecules can be tested in this way. And they can be tested as a single mixture rather than 1 million individual tests. So 1 million more molecules than can be tested in the past, 1 million times faster in the past. A proposal was made in 1992. It is only in the last couple of years that it's come into use, and it has given remarkable results. Just as an example, a molecule was recently identified that binds to insulin-degrading enzyme, which is involved, it is thought, in type 2 diabetes. And a molecule of this sort had been sought for decades and couldn't be found until this approach was introduced. The other recent advance that I'll mention even more briefly holds promise of doing even more and better. So 1 million molecules is still much less than needed to test all possibilities. But if a molecule can be found that works even to a limited extent, as I've mentioned, it can be optimized by computation rather than through the efforts of hundreds of chemists over a period of years. Now, computation for this purpose was tried without success for decades. Just in the last few years, a group of Russian physicists obtained, for the first time, meaningful results by what is called, and I won't explain the details, a quantum approach. Their method is not widely known and not yet exploited in the industry or even in academic laboratories for the most part, but it works. And I'll just show you one last slide relating to science, which illustrates the point. So here what was done was to make calculations of molecules binding to a target, and it's what you see on the left by this new approach is a comparison of the experimental results with those of calculation, and there's a very good correlation between experiment and calculation. In contrast, the method that is used everywhere today in all chemical companies and in academic laboratories, the classical method, gives only a random result. It really doesn't work at all for calculating drug binding to a target. So by this approach, one can calculate in a few days what it took hundreds of chemists years to synthesize and to test in the past. It is possible to make more potent drugs, to discover new drugs, but also to make existing ones better. Now, these two recent advances serve, as I have said, just to illustrate the power of chemistry and the promise of progress in drug development. This is, I think, a genuinely exciting promise. The question is, how rapidly will this promise be realized? And the reason there's a question is because of the very success of medical science and of the underlying scientific activity that I've mentioned. Success has become, in a way, the undoing of medical science. People are so impressed by the knowledge that's been acquired, they rush to apply it to medical problems, which is understandable, but sometimes carried to excess. And I suggest to consider, just for example, the human genome, which is the font of all medical knowledge. The answer to every question about human biology and medicine is written in the human genome. But the genome is a multi-dimensional and, as Ahmed would say, a dynamic language. The products of the genome, which are both protein molecules and RNA molecules, interact with one another in an extraordinarily complex way. And at present, we can only dimly perceive the significance. In fact, we can really only explain about 1% of what there is to know about human biology. Now, just imagine if modern medicine today flows from less than 1% of all possible knowledge of human biology, how much more could be done if we knew the remaining 99%? What more persuasive call to the pursuit of basic research can you possibly imagine? And yet, this call is, I think, often unheeded when one travels around the country or abroad. It's really disappointing to see the extent of neglect of research in favor of application. And it's I would say, ironic. And I told you what we perceive as the lesson of the past. To solve a difficult problem, don't study it directly. Do basic research. Well, now, just as this lesson has been learned, it seems to be forgotten. What Charles Eliot started at Harvard has been stopped in many places. For example, at Stanford Medical School, which pays my salary and would not appreciate what I'm about to say. Stanford used to epitomize scientific medicine. It was at Stanford where the basis for genetic engineering was discovered and established. Yet, only a few years ago, the Stanford administration, in its wisdom, eliminated basic science from the medical curriculum. So back to before Charles Eliot. Why? How did that happen? Well, the answer is, of course, both social and political. And the social part really revolves around young people. As I don't really need to tell you, young people are the wellspring of discovery. Most discoveries, sad to say for Ahmed and me and Peter, are made by people in their early careers, usually in their 20s and 30s. Ahmed is an exception, having invented 4D microscopy much later in life, but I can't claim the same. The most precious of resources, young people in science, is being depleted. And that's true for a couple of reasons, one of which at least is bureaucratic, so it may be reversible. And in the following several slides, I draw upon a manuscript that is written by my colleague Michael Levitt, which is still unpublished, and I thank him for it. So I begin with the first of these slides from Michael, which shows the percentage of scientific investigators in universities, faculty members, as a function of age. Either the number who hold individual investigator-initiated research grants, or R01 grants from the NIH, or the numbers who are on the faculty of medical schools. And this was the situation in 1980, where the median or the peak of the distribution was at around 35 years of age. Now, if we look at the evolution over time from 1980, you see what the trend is. It goes on and on and on, always in the same direction, unfortunately so, culminating finally near the present time in the year 2010, where finally the peak of the distribution is near about age 50. So what you see is that the average independent investigator today is past the age of creativity, or at least the age of maximal creativity. And what's worse, as the next slide shows, the number of young investigators, here the number, Michael has chosen the cutoff age of 46, so the number below the age of 46 receiving individual investigator-initiated research grants from NIH is actually declining, while the number older than 56 is rapidly rising. And perhaps worst of all, the number of young basic scientists, whether recipients of grants from NIH or of any other kind, is declining. The decline began 30 years ago, and it continues to the present day. Now, the decline is not, and can't be entirely blamed on Congress. It's not entirely due to a lack of appropriation of funds. A bolus of about $100 billion entered the system between approximately the year 2000 and the year 2010. This was due, as you know, to the doubling of the appropriation for the NIH. Unfortunately, because of less than flat funding in recent years, we're only back at the point that we would have achieved if funding had gone along the lines that had done before the time of the doubling of the budget. But nevertheless, the question is, where did that $100 billion go? Well, certainly not to the support of young investigators. One must presume it went into the budgets of older scientists, perhaps the large research programs, the targeted research, and the like. I really don't know. The problem is that I'm describing to you is really very well known. I mean, it's been identified, it's been described, it's been worried about before. The question is what to do about it. Now, some may say that with approximately 15,000 total basic scientists in the country, the decline in the number of young ones, those under the age of 46, isn't such a cause for concern. But the answer, I believe, is along the lines of what I told you, that young scientists are the most likely to discover something, and numbers matter. And the reason is because of what Ahmed said toward the end of his lecture. Discovery is not planned. It can't be predicted. John Wanamaker, who was a famous 19th century marketing pioneer, said, "Half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which half." There is a way to plan for, to budget for discovery, and it's to support many talented, independent young investigators, and discoveries will follow. Discovery is a numbers game. The insufficient number of research grants to young investigators is probably only one of several causes for their declining number, but it's one, perhaps the only one, we can hope to change. You know, if you consider the plight of a young scientist today, 5 or 6 years as a graduate student at less than minimum wage, another 3 to 5 years as a postdoc, probably still on starvation wages, followed by uncertain, even unlikely prospects of employment, followed by the challenge of obtaining grant support and eventual tenure. It's no wonder that so many young people succumb to what I would call the siren call of Silicon, or they reach for riches in finance on Wall Street. When my colleague Michael Levitt wrote the manuscript I just alluded to, he suggested 2 ways of addressing the problem of insufficient research money for young people. One would be a large increase in the number of what are called K-99 grants that encourage early independence of young investigators. And another, he suggested, is to address a bias against young investigators at study sections. His calculations, Michael's analysis, showed that the chances of a young investigator succeeding in an application are much, much less than that of an older one. Now, the bias is not surprising. simply because an older investigator has a longer publication record, more preliminary data upon which to base an application. And such a bias might possibly be removed by a correction factor applied to priority scores or what have you. It's sometimes asked, why not rely for additional support upon the private sector? Well, the answer, as you know, I'm sure, is simple. The support of basic research has traditionally come from government rather than the private sector, and for a good reason. The timeline of basic research is so long. Fundamental problems take decades to solve, and only the public with a lifelong interest can be expected to support such an undertaking. Industry with a short-term interest and an eye on the bottom line can hardly be expected to do so. What CEO could report to his or her board that a major investment has been made in a research project that may or may not become profitable in 10 or 20 years? The problem is an increasing focus on the short term, and it's a focus on short-term gain in government as well as in industry. Politicians rarely look beyond the next election. I was made most aware of this a few years ago when I was asked to speak before the leadership of the Senate, so Harry Reid, Mitch McConnell, and others, and I had done that kind of thing a couple of times before, and I was frustrated by the lack of response. So I called up a friend, Dr. Larry Norton from the Memorial Sloan Kettering, who's one of the leading oncologists in the country, and I asked him how to get their attention. And he said, look around the room. He said, if there are more than 20 people over 60, tell them that there are 2 people in this room with an undiagnosed fatal cancer. And if you will support our research, we will cure you. So the person who spoke before me at this gathering was Bill Brody, who was then president of Johns Hopkins, and he made an eloquent plea for the support of research. And I looked around while he was speaking, and Harry Reid was checking his cell phone, and Mitch McConnell was conferring with his aides, and no one was paying any attention at all. And then it came my turn, and I followed Larry's advice. And the room went quiet, and everybody looked up, and no one said a thing for about 30 seconds, and then Harry Reid said, that's why you got to vote Democratic in November. And everything returned to normal. Older, wiser, and sometimes even grayer colleagues of mine have told me not to bother. They say American science has peaked and it's in a process of decline. And I prefer to invoke the spirit of Ahmed Zewail, which is the spirit of indomitable optimism. The battle for basic science will never be won, but clearly it must be fought in every generation. And if you want to know what is optimism, go to Russia. The conditions for science in Russia are bad beyond imagination, and yet all the scientists are smiling. And when I ask why they're so optimistic, they tell me because all the pessimists are dead. So we continue, and we will continue, to make the case for basic science. And we do it, of course, for the improvement of the human condition. We do it also for another reason. And again, I would invoke the spirit of Ahmed, which I think is summed up by a story that I was told years ago about Isidore Rabi, who was a great physicist at Columbia University in the 1930s. Rabi had discovered how to measure the magnetic moments of atomic nuclei, which research was really a forerunner of magnetic resonance today. And Rabi said that one day he had made a new measurement and discovered the magnetic moment of a nucleus of an atom that hadn't ever been determined before, and then he got on the subway and he was on his way home, and he looked around the subway car at all the people sitting on the seats, and he thought to himself, I am the only person here who knows the value of that magnetic moment. So that, I think, is the reason why so many of us do science. It's for this personal as well as societal reward. It is in the best spirit of Ahmed Zewail. Ahmed, I thank you, and I thank all of you.